Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hyperspace on the Dark Matter Radio Network. I'm your host, Solaris BlueRaven. I want to thank everybody for tuning in this evening, and a special thank you to webmaster and producer Keith Rowland. And my special guest this evening is Cheryl Costa. And Cheryl Costa is a Syracuse, New York resident and a native of Corning, New York. She served in the United States military twice. She served in the U.S. Air Force as a telephone cable technician with service in Vietnam. Later in the U.S. Navy, she served as an electronics tech working with radar and advanced surveillance electronics systems. Professionally, she was a senior information assurance engineer for a top Fortune 100 aerospace company from which she recently retired after 32 years. As a vocation, she was a talk radio personality in the metropolitan Washington, D.C. area from 1998 to 2001, where she hosted a weekly radio program on Business Talk, WMET, 1150 a.m. The program was called The X Factor. For 2 hours every Saturday night, she and her author guests captivated listeners with discussions of unidentified flying objects, ghost hunting, remote viewing, Archeo-astronomy, paranormal phenomena, spirituality, crypto-zoology, time travel, alien abductions, and much more. And in July of 2013, she began writing UFO-oriented newspaper column called New York Skies for the Syracuse NewYorkTimes.com. Since the launch, the column has enjoyed huge web readership and has an international following. And please welcome Cheryl to the show this evening. Hi, Cheryl.
Hi. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing tonight?
Terrific.
Good. Well, you sound fabulous, and I'm so excited to have you on, and we have so much to discuss. So where do you want to start? Let's talk about what you've been up to for the past few weeks.
Looking for a job.
We'll send the good vibes out your way.
I sometimes wonder if the fact that I have one line on my resume that says I write New York Skies for the Syracuse New Times, and they go out and Google it, and they find out it's the only UFO column in New York State in a mainstream paper, and I wonder if that hurts me. I don't know.
It shouldn't.
But I hope it doesn't.
No,
I've actually had a couple of recruiters say that that's a cool thing, so I guess it's okay.
Right. Well, you have a stellar bio, by the way. So, yeah, you're definitely something wonderful will come your way, I'm sure. And I do want to get into the work that you're involved in. I mean, investigating the UFO phenomenon and also the documentation you have. You have a fascinating amount of information that you've acquired over the years, and I do want to get started with that on a historical level. So wherever you want to start, but how did you get involved in the UFO phenomenon to begin with? What really attracted you to that?
Well, I guess I saw my first UFO when I was 12 with my mother, and there was this big shiny ball sitting there in the sky, and it was a clear blue sky on a late August, early September afternoon, and that thing just hung there for 20 minutes, and then when it left in a flash, and that captivated my attention. I was 12, maybe 13 years old. And my mother explained, when we first saw it, maybe it's a weather balloon, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. On the other hand, maybe it's, and then she explained what the term was, UFO, and that there might be people from another world, da-da-da-da. And that formed a very interesting bond between my mother and myself. And like for my years in junior high school and high school, we would both go to the library, and if a new book came in, one or the other of us would check it out and read it to the other or share it with the other, and we kept pretty good track of it. And like I said, I was always a UFO bystander. I read stuff whenever I saw stuff come along. I would read it and things like this. Check a book out from the library, that type of thing. I wasn't what you would call a fanatic about it. But I kept track of it. And then in 1990, I had to have some emergency surgery, and I was literally between apartments when it happened. And I ended up, a friend of mine gave me the keys to a house he had. He was taking care of his dad who had cancer, so he was staying with his dad in another house in town. He gave me the keys and said, feed the cat and pay the utilities. So I stayed there. Well, this guy had about every first edition book on UFO phenomena that had been written up until that time.
Nice.
He had all these first edition hardback books of Stanton Friedman and all these guys, right? So with no cable in the house, I had about 3-4 months with nothing better to do than to recuperate and read all his books. So again, I got very heavy on the topic, and again, I didn't do anything with it. And then when it came up to around 1998, I was a weekend operations manager for a radio business talk radio station, and the general manager called me up one afternoon and said, "Hey, Art Bell's off the air with his show." And that happened sometime in '98. And she said, "Hey, we've got quite a listenership on the weekends and Saturday evening, and on the network. And would you be up to doing a show kind of like an Art Bell kind of show?" And so I said, "Sure." So we decided to do this 2 to 3 hour show called The X Factor. And at first I struggled for guests, but then once I got plugged into a few of the major publishers, I ended up being the stop in Washington, D.C. if you were peddling a book on anything paranormal, ancient aliens, UFOs, crypto-zoology, remote viewing, you name it, we did it. And then and that was that. And then a couple of years ago, 2012, and I'll short the story out real quick here. 2012, I was reading an article in, I think it was online CNN.com or something like that. And they have a lot of sidebar articles. And I saw this one little headline that said, "UFOs, were they always just an urban legend?" And I said, "Huh? What's that about?" So I went in and looked at the story, and these guys were saying that UFO sightings had been on the decline since the 80s, and maybe they were always just an urban legend anyway. And I thought about this a minute, and I said, who are these guys talking to, And so I went out to the MUFON site, and I knew they had a database, so I went out there and got on their online interface, and I used to be a data cruncher for Lockheed. I would crunch data, and so I started doing a few reports for myself and started dropping numbers into a spreadsheet, and I'm sitting there saying, I ended up with a spreadsheet that went from a very low and then went up almost exponentially across the graph, and I said, what memo didn't the UFOs get? Because they were exponentially increasing in sightings. And I don't know who these people were that wrote this article, but it was obviously misinformation because UFO sightings are going through the roof, and especially in the last 8 to 10 years, they've just gone through the roof.
Wow! So that's the last 8 to 10 years. Now we're talking about this timeline.
Yeah,
it's increased.
In fact, I did a chart a couple months ago for the last 15 years. And it's in excess of 46, just in New York State, in excess of 4,600 sightings.
Wow! And
over a period of 15 years. And then what I managed to do, and this is like my current project, I went and I combined the databases from the National UFO Reporting Center and the MUFON database for the same window, 1999 to the end of 2014. And it was a little difficult because the National UFO Reporting Database didn't collect county data. Okay? They only had cities. So what I had to do is I had to suck their data into a spreadsheet, normalize it, and then sit there 3,600 lines worth of reports. And over a period of about 6 evenings for about 6 months, I had to sit here and look up every town, city, major metropolitan area, and every little whistle stop that was mentioned in the database and look up what county they were in. And now it's not so bad when you had a major metropolitan area, maybe a couple of hundred sightings were associated with a particular major city in the state. That wasn't so hard, but it was picking out all these little ones that took forever. It was tedious. But once I did get it, I combined both databases, and I did a sort by counties. And I now have a report that I can tell you from 1999 to the end of 2014, 15 years, what the sighting counts were by county in New York State. And what was really wild was we have 63 counties here. There was a handful of counties, barely 2 handfuls, that had astronomically larger numbers than other counties. And and nobody could figure out what the deal is. How come? I'll give you an example. Monroe County, up where Rochester, New York is. I showed it to some of the UFO experts here in New York, and they looked at it and said, "There's no nuclear reactor there. There's no military bases there. There's no this there. There's no that there," and nobody could figure out why it was there, why this thing was spiking. And there was another one out there in the western end of the state. In fact, There's two places in New York State, down in the Hudson Valley. There's a couple places in the Hudson Valley claim to be the UFO capital of the New York State. They aren't. I've identified counties that have far more sightings than they do.
Wow, that's fascinating. So what other counties are there that have the real high spiking?
They are. Give me a moment. I'm going to have to pull this out of my folder here a second. Okay, here they are. And I'll give you an example. Erie County, out in western New York, out towards where Buffalo is. Okay, they have very, very large. But let's start with the top ones here. In a 15-year window, Suffolk County and Long Island, 541 sightings. Okay, New York County. Now, that's not all New York City. That's just New York County. There's 5 counties in the New York City area, 400 sightings. Erie County, out where Buffalo is, 305. Nassau County in the western Long Island, 286. Kings County in the New York City area, 224. Westchester, again, same region, 216. Monroe County, where Rochester is, up here in central Finger Lakes, New York area, right there on Lake Ontario, 212. That's huge. Because the population isn't any. People say, well, it's got to be about population in New York City, and I would agree. But you get up the Rochester, New York area, and that county, the population is nowhere near what it is in the New York City or Long Island area.
Right.
So 212 sightings over 14 years is huge. And if New York State's broken up into what they call economic districts, so they'll block like 8 or 10 counties in a certain area, like the Finger Lakes area or the western New York or northern New York or the southern tier or the New York City area or the Hudson Valley. They'll block certain counties together as an economic region. And each economic region had at least one county that was through the roof, if not 2, but usually 1. And it was very interesting. And then as soon as you get down to after about the first top 10, they drop off. The counties drop off to 30 to 50 sightings over 15 years, which is nothing. But there's these ones that are through the roof. It's really interesting. And what we couldn't do, we went out, and my editor looked at this and was shocked. And he said, well, I want you to go out and I want you to see if this stuff corresponds to earthquake faults, pollution. The only thing that seemed to be consistent was it looked like it matched up with the population centers in New York State. We thought, well, maybe the UFOs are just studying us, the people, because the major amount of the sightings across the central part of the state were right along what we would call the Erie Canal, the New York State Thruway pattern, right? But again, that wasn't exactly. And then I was talking with Ben Moss, who is the head MUFON investigator for Virginia. I sent him a PDF of my slides, and he took a look at them, and he said, whoa, okay. He says, tell you what. He says, see if you can find a map of ancient Indian, Native American tribal areas, tribal lands, which I did. And I superimposed the map over the hot spots, and guess what? There's a hot spot on every single major Native American realm, what we would call the Iroquois Confederacy. There is a major UFO hotspot on every major UFO Iroquois Confederacy nation in New York State.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating.
And it blew me away when I saw it. It was like,
what about ley lines?
We tried ley lines, and amazingly enough, no.
Okay, I was just curious.
The wisdom, I had to go out and find a real ley line expert. I went through about 4 people, and when I brought the material up to the 4 people I was talking to, and boy, they all got looking at it, and they said, no, you need to talk to this guy. And they all pointed me to this guy out in Connecticut, and I got a hold of him, and he took a look at this, and he said, yeah, it might talk to some of it, but not all what you're showing me here, So it wasn't ley lines. So that's when I went to Ben Moss from MUFON, Virginia, and I'd met him at a convention, and we kind of hit it off. And I talked to him, and I said, Ben, I don't know what the heck this is. And I sent him the slides. He looked at them, and he said, check it out against Native American tribal lands, and it has a pretty good correlation. Now, that said, my spouse was a professional librarian, research librarian, worked at the National Academy of Science, that kind of librarian, okay? It makes me say this disclaimer: correlation does not mean causality.
Right? Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting.
That's the paper we're writing right now, and my editor liked it. My column is normally 300 to 500 words, and my editor liked this so much he wants me to write a 2,500-word feature story. So that's what we're working on right now.
Well, that's fascinating. And you also wonder if they're not summoning somehow the tribes, maybe through consciousness, or summoning these craft. Do you think that's a possibility or no?
These days, I don't know.
Or maybe it's the residual imprint that's there that still draws the craft, or the power and the energy transmission. Who knows, huh?
It might be. It might be. I mean, there's an argument to be made that, the Native American culture was out there doing ceremonies and, as they say, feeding the land for day in, day out for generations until white man came here.
Right.
And who knows? Maybe there is a residual effect there.
It certainly would seem that way.
Yeah.
Kind of not necessarily a haunt, but something with an imprint or a signature of some kind. That's fascinating. What about bodies of water? Now, you mentioned the bodies of water. Is there an attraction with the sightings in that area with bodies of water? You mentioned Lake Ontario, I believe, right?
Yeah, that was one of the things that some of the other New York State investigators looked at. They saw Lake Ontario right there, and they also saw the Erie County area, which is getting over by Lake Erie. And, of course, people who know about that kind of Lake Erie refer to the UFO sightings there. They call it the Lake Erie effect. Well, when I showed the chart to this one expert, he looked at it and he said, "Jeepers creepers, maybe we have a Lake Ontario effect too, But what something a lot of people don't know, and they brought this up on Hangar One some time ago, that the Great Lakes have nearly or more missing persons under unusual circumstances than the Bermuda Triangle does.
That's interesting.
They call it the Great Lakes Triangle. And so for all we know, there's a base, an underwater USO's base underneath Lake Ontario. I don't know. I've known for a long time that the Niagara Frontier, the Erie area, was heavy for UFO sightings. And but I didn't know, who knew that Lake Monroe County was like that, and Albany, New York. It's up on the Hudson, but it's not by a major body of water other than the Hudson River. And so Long Island, you can make a case, Long Island Sound, and all that, but it was really, really perplexing as we laid the data out. And I got a lot of people online that knew, that were like what I'm going to call the New York State experts. I think I got about 6 people that take a look at these charts. And some of these guys are really busy with conventions and things, so getting a few minutes of their time online to talk to them was difficult. But we managed, and so we'll see. I'm hoping to give a presentation on this real soon. I might be speaking at a small mini convention at the end of June, so I'm thinking of if I can have these slides ready for that, I'd like to present it.
That'd be awesome. I'd like to see it at one of the bigger events as well as one of the big speakers out there. That'd be great. You have so much information, and we're going to get into that tonight, too. What about the underground? Now, you did touch a little bit maybe on the underground bases. Is that a possibility that some of these sightings where these ships are located, or these craft, perhaps are connected to the underground bases underneath where it just looks kind of mundane from an observer's point of view?
Well, okay. Have you ever heard of the Montauk, all the stuff, the Montauk Point and all that stuff, right? All right. Suffolk County is where Montauk is. So that didn't surprise me that they were the number one on the hit parade, as they say.
Right.
Okay, that didn't surprise me. But Albany did. Monroe County did. Broome County, New York, did. They surprised me. I had a professor from Sonoma University in California grab me after my presentation out at the International UFO Congress down in Arizona this past February. Mm-hmm. I had presented a presentation 200 years of UFOs over New York State, and he grabbed me at the cocktail party that evening and said that he was doing research on some man-made caves, clearly not natural caves, man-made caves down in the Hudson Valley area, down in what we're going to call the hot spot for UFOs on the Hudson Valley. Mm-hmm. And they had studied these things, that they know exactly where these caves are by GPS. They even know the zip code for them. These caves, he said, have Archeo-astronomy alignments. They like the sunlight from the winter solstice or the fall equinox or something might light it up or something on that order. Mm-hmm. So he's doing this massive research project on that, and he came to me and he said, "Do you have county sighting information?" And I said, "Yes, I'm accumulating it." And he said, "Would you share it with me, and I'll give you a credit line on my paper?" And I said, "Sure, happy to." Mm-hmm. So. Anytime you can get your name on an academic paper is a good thing. So, so I contacted him and I sent him my data, and he found it very interesting. And I told him I didn't want to go back because the databases prior to about 1993 are a little shaky, because databases used to be things that people send in clippings to somebody like a MUFON, or some guy had a database and he was keeping it in his back room or something. It was a very, very loose thing up until about the time the internet really started getting going in the middle 90s. Prior to that, UFO reports were either phoned in, if you knew the number, phoned into somebody's answering machine, or faxed in, or you cut a clipping out of your local paper, provided somebody printed it in the paper and you mailed it to these people. And that was about the only way this information got into any kind of a collection. Mm-hmm. Right. And then in the middle 90s, we started seeing, late 80s, early 90s, we started getting like America Online and CompuServe and that kind of thing. And then people started communicating with email and listservs and that type of thing, and we started getting more reporting. And then by around 2003-ish, National UFO Reporting Center and MUFON both came online with web interfaces, and publicity started going out that way. Around 2009, somebody did a documentary, I think it was on public television or something, about MUFON's database, and sightings went up in that base because not so much that there was more sightings, it's just people had the ability to report them. So sometimes little spikes you see on the reporting graphs, I have to account when I'm doing a presentation. I have to tell people, well, this here is an artifact of reporting. This happened at that date, or people went online at this date, or there was a documentary about the MUFON database and it went off the scale. You have to report that stuff and not just say, oh, there was an increase of UFOs that year. No, that's not the case. It was just an artifact of reporting.
Right, and that makes sense.
And again, my spouse, the librarian, will emphasize that fact.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, what about when 9/11 occurred? Do you know if there was a historical spike in UFO activity around 9/11?
I don't remember if there was or not.
Okay.
I know some people have mentioned it in passing. But, some people have mentioned it in passing, but I personally don't know.
Okay.
I know that there was, I've seen documentaries where they talked about the aspect that there was almost sort of a precog thing on the internet. People started trying to look up information about the Twin Towers in the hours prior to the place, and the hours and days prior to it getting hit.
That's interesting.
It's like this, and this guy had been monitoring the internet and watching trends on data, and it was like the global community that was connected had like a precognitive, field spike hours and days before it happened.
That's really interesting.
I know a month before it happened, the monks, I used to live in a Buddhist monastery, and the monks at the Buddhist monastery, a couple of the more devout ones were talking to me one night over dinner, and they know I'm on the clairvoyant side, and they said, something weird's getting ready to happen, isn't it? And we all kind of looked at each other and said, yeah, you feel it too? And this was about 3 weeks before it happened.
My goodness.
So, there was a lot of people who had a feeling of it, that it had, and what we all picked up on was this overwhelming sense of grief and shock. We didn't know what it was. We thought maybe there was going to be an earthquake or something. So.
Right. Wow, it almost sounds like there was a time slip or something like that. You always wonder what's happening in the illusion of time when people start having premonitions like that, or foreboding energy that connects in. And I was just curious because I heard something along the lines of perhaps a spike in UFO anomalies and things like that when people are getting, when that amount of people are ready to transfer out, really not ready, but taken too quickly, you would think that something would open up like a vortex or something connected in.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
I can't talk about. I do know that there is. Again, I don't know what to make of it, but there's some information out there in the internet where people talk about there's a group of people that say that there were verifiable UFOs hovering in the D.C. in the Washington. I'm sorry, not Washington. In the New York City area, in the hours of. During the hours of the plane hits, the aircraft hits, and there was like logs. People were, like somebody when the airport was tracking them or something like that, But I don't know if you can believe everything you find on the internet. I don't know what's misinformation, what's real.
Exactly.
The stuff I report in my column. I have to take most people report anonymously in the databases because they're afraid of ridicule. And so, I've had editors, how do you know it's accurate? I don't know if it's accurate, but it's what people took the time to go out onto one of these online databases and fill out a UFO report, which is like filling out a credit report. It's pretty long, it's tedious. And there's a lot of information on one of these things, and my feeling. And I told this one editor, I said, I report what people say they saw. It's not I'm not that kind of a journalist. I don't go out there to try and prove it. I'm simply reporting what people say they saw.
Right. That's good.
And I was not trained as a traditional journalist. I was trained as a playwright, and playwrights have a similar mission to report history that journalists do. I'm not bound by some of the same. I can report yarns and stories, and where a news journalist has to sort of go out there and prove it. I don't have to. I simply report what people say they saw, and if they're lying to me, shame on them.
Exactly. And you would think that they wouldn't be. I mean, I would say the majority of people are pretty sincere. And I'm also wondering if it isn't synchronized insofar as, did you get a lot of reports of people synchronizing on one sighting in one location?
No.
Okay.
I had one where I reported 3 different people's sightings only based on, because I had it in the internet. I had it in one of the databases. Okay. And what happened was there were multiple reports in the database. And it was literally from different perspectives. It was up in the Finger Lakes, and it was multiple perspectives of the same sighting, which was interesting. It was one of the few times I saw this. And so I wrote the story from 3 different people's perspectives. Now remember, I can't use the real names. In most cases, I don't know them. So I'm saying, Frank and Sally saw this, and this is what they saw. And then, meanwhile, across town, Bob and Amy saw this. And at the same time, over in Mabel and Ron saw this, and because the timeline lined up on the report, I could see that this was all happening over about a 10-minute window locally. Okay, I had one like that. I had another one like that up in the North Country of upstate New York, up in the Adirondacks, where it's a lot of lakes out in the middle of nowhere, and you got to drive 40 miles to get to a gas station. Okay, it's pretty rural out there, and there was this. I saw this one report. It was a number of years ago. I saw this one report by this one lake. Family was at their camp up at this lake for a summer trip, And then I saw another one at similar time, same day. And I went between both databases. I accumulated 9 different reports over the period of 30 minutes. I was able to put it on the map, and I was literally able to track the path of the 3 UFOs that people saw cruising through the sky.
Oh wow, that's interesting.
Over a distance of about 50 miles. Wow.
What year was that? Do you know offhand?
I don't remember offhand, but it was actually rather recently. It was when I say recently, it was in the 2000s. I think it was around 2003 or 2004, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. Now, last year, 2014, there was a sighting, and I found out about it, but quite by accident. I was working at another newspaper in their printing factory, where they actually print newspapers are done on huge, mammoth 700-ton presses and things, right? Mm-hmm. And the press master happened to come by me one evening, and we were both getting coffee, and he looks at me and he says, "My son saw a UFO Saturday night. Big one, big bright ones, going over Syracuse." I said, "Really? Can I talk to him?" And he traded me. He got to pull his phone out, gave me the kid's number, and I played tag with the kid for about a week, and I got a hold of him. This kid was just coming out of college. So I talked to him, and he gave me all the data, and I wrote it all down, and I went back into the database and looked it up. And the other thing the kid told me was he looked at it, and this was in the middle of the winter, and he said that there had been a report. When I say middle of winter, I think it was October or something like that, or November, but it was after dark, that he went on to see if there was anything on the news, and he saw on the internet that they had these sightings of a similar formation up in Toronto. So I made a note of that, went out and Googled it and everything, and I tracked a couple of other stories, and I had about 7 or 8 stories, and the reports started at the eastern end of Long Island, came across Long Island, across Westchester County, up through the Catskills, across central New York, out towards the Buffalo area and onto Toronto, and they lost track of them around 10:30 up about 100 miles north of Toronto.
Wow, that's interesting.
Okay? And that was last year. It was about last November, December time frame.
Wow, did they give a description of the ships or the craft?
No, just several bright orange lights in the sky. Mm-hmm. They said they had more structure than the fuzzy fireball ones, the orange fireball orbs, mm-hmm. but they said they seemed to have a very defined structure to them, just bright orange discs, or yellowish orange discs, is how they were described. And it was pretty consistent all the way across. And it was fascinating for me because I was doing this. I had a great big map here tacked up on the wall. And my spouse and I were sitting there with pins doing the CSI thing of tracking the timeline,
Right.
So,
oh, that's fun.
So yeah, it is, and it was like I said, it was a very interesting article to write.
Yeah.
The one I wrote for this week's article was in 1993. It was one of 3 military police MPs that were part of the guard detachment at West Point Military Academy. And it was a moonlit night, and they were down by the parade field, and they had done their patrol, and nothing ever happens at West Point, the way this guy described it to me, okay? Mm-hmm. And he said they were out there shooting the breeze, the on-shift guards, about 10:30 or so at night. And all of a sudden, the three cops is talking, and the other guy is looking at him and says, "What the heck is that?" And the guy kind of ignores him. He said, "No, look, what the heck is that?" And they turn around, and silhouetted between them and one of the mountains behind them, as the guy described it, was this big black silhouette hovering there. And he said it was this big, looked like a 6-story building laying on its side, and it was 2 stories thick. And it was black. And of course, but it was a moonlit night, and that's why it showed up. And he described the light pattern on it and all that thing. And then when it decided to leave, it flashed 3 times like a camera flash. The whole thing lit up and flashed very quickly, and then suddenly the thing just kind of leaned to one side, and it was like, wow, gone. Winked out. It was gone.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's not a black triangle, though, is it, or no?
Well, he didn't describe it as a black triangle, but, it sounds an awful lot like one.
Mm-hmm.
2-story thick, half a football field long, yeah, that sounds like a black triangle to me.
Wow.
But he didn't call it that. I just described it as, the black mass that he said it was, and I described how big it was, and that was about it.
That's amazing.
That's the one that's going to be going up day after tomorrow.
Oh, cool. Wow, and of course...
You got a preview.
Excellent. So if people want to access, once again, let's give them their website so we can get them over there and start looking at some of these articles.
Okay, what we have available online most of the time is about the last 8 to 10 of my articles, okay? And if you go to Syracuse New Times, all one word, SyracuseNewTimes.com, and then when you get onto SyracuseNewTimes.com, go across the navigation bar, hovering your mouse over blogs, and there'll be a drop-down window, and there should be about the second one down or so. It will say New York skies, and usually in parentheses it says the UFO column. You click on that, and the page you come to, the top article is the most recent one put up, probably last Friday morning, and then below it will be probably 8 to 10 of the previous articles. And that's how they do it. Now, the only time that changes is if I'm at a major UFO conference. My editor always has me do daily reports from the convention. So sometimes, when the week I was out at the International UFO Congress, I was filing 500-word stories every night, and they were in the next day's paper.
Wow, you're busy. Yeah,
it was busy. It was busy, and the other thing is he had me take 2 video cameras with me, digital video cameras, and I had my laptop. And my spouse and I, the convention had put us up in a suite since I was a speaker. And so we had, you got a suite's nice because you got a bedroom off the one side and you got a living room session there. So I set up a camera setup with that, and I would get on and grab major speakers or major vendors and drag them up to my suite and give them a cup of coffee or tea or a soda or something and sit there and interview them. So I interviewed about 10, 15 people. And did I put all that information up on the newspaper? No, I didn't. But what it's been nice for is I've been able to go back and listen to some of their interviews, watch some of the interviews online now, 6 months later, and pick little things out so I get to quote them now and then. Mm-hmm. From these interviews, which just comes in very handy. The other thing that came in handy, too, was I would usually edit a little 1-minute snippet of an interview, and then I would upload it to my editor on Drop Zone, and he would usually include it with the articles the next morning. So we had a combination written reports and video. This was very unique what we did, and the reason for this, and this is what my editor has told the directors of several major conventions. Cheryl Costa, that's me. I was the only invented reporter with a UFO voice. There were lots of other press there reporting, here's the cute UFO enthusiast. Mm-hmm. No, I was the only one there with the UFO voice reporting substantive stuff that was part of the color of being at the convention for those who couldn't come to the convention.
Nice.
And I interviewed people who did, I would tell what speakers were on that day, and the ones that I really liked, I would go and interview them and get them up in our room, give them a soda and interview them. So I got a lot of material. I got to interview Travis Walton, the guy who was in the movie Fire in the Sky.
Right. Yeah.
I got to interview the guy.
Excellent. Very good.
And he was absolutely the most soft-spoken gentleman you ever met in your life, and I enjoyed talking to him. It was a very, very laid-back talk, and nothing special, no hard questions. We just had a nice conversation, and I just happened to have a camera running while we were doing it. It was fun.
Well, it's great to document this information. I mean, it's and I know it's been documented before, but still, seen through different eyes, through different windows of the soul, so to speak, it really does. It makes a difference, in my opinion. Not everybody interviews the same. So I think that it's important, and especially with your kind of background, you're really analytical. I like your style, and I love the way you keep everything very articulate and very down to earth. And so far, it's not really like La La Land with you. It's all just documented information. I like that about you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that a lot of people were taken back by, in fact, I had a number of reporters come up and talk to me about it, because I was the only person there who was showing charts and graphs.
Right. Good.
I had counts, I had maps, I had charts and graphs and explanations as to what things were, and I showed people a lot of stuff, and I had people all weekend long wanted to take their picture with me, and I said, why are they doing it? And my spouse just simply said, yeah, you're a rock star, you know. But the funny thing was everybody, I said, why? And they said, you're the only person here. Everybody else sits up there and stands up behind the podium like a wooden Indian. And I was out there dancing all over the stage. And I'm kind of big and flamboyant in that way, you know, in explaining things. And so I guess that a little bit of showmanship goes a long way.
Well, I think it's great. You put both together as well. And I do like the idea that you have the charts and the graphs, because I think that is huge. People need to look at things, and they need to see numbers. They need to see a pattern. A lot of people do, not everybody. But I'm the one who likes to look and see where and how to track these things, these sightings, and what you're doing, the way you're correlating the data, the way you're tracking it, I think is fabulous personally, because it puts it all into perspective insofar as what's really happening here.
Well, you know, the other thing I did when I was there, I looked at them and said, look, I don't do the rest of the country. New York State's my beat, okay? I said, any one of you can go on to MUFON or go out there to National UFO Reporting Center and pull up the database for your state and do the same thing I'm doing, and crunching the data. And you don't have to have fancy software tools to do it. When I first started doing the stuff with the databases, I would literally make a PDF copy of it, take it down to my print store, have them dump me a copy of it, and it cost me $15, $20 to get them dump the whole thing. And then I would sit there literally with a red pen counting the New York sightings out of the base with a red pen. You know, on a rainy night, be sitting here counting these things by hand because you couldn't sort them out of the database or something. Same thing with the MUFON. You had to limit your searches to so many. Now, I know there's some MUFON investigators out there saying, well, gee, if you certified yourself as a MUFON investigator, you could have free access to the CMS system and run the reports any way you want. Yeah, I could have, but the problem is because I'm writing a newspaper column, being a investigator for MUFON represented a conflict of interest, and it was an ethical issue for me. And my editor and I both talked about this at length, and we both agreed there was an ethical issue there. So I do private research. I'm a citizen scientist, but I don't do it for MUFON. I don't do it for National UFO Reporting Center. I try to be somewhat independent in that regard. And my college professors like that idea. It's the old idea of being the what's the term they use? The bystander intellectual who analyzes the situation and can comment and do dissenting commentary when everybody else has an axe to grind, you know, because they're paid to.
Absolutely.
That's kind of what I do. I kind of try and stay like I've always been all my life. I try to be that bystander who can make an objective commentary. And I encouraged other people to, when I was at the convention, I encouraged other people to pick up a pen and start counting these things and start looking at what was really going on in their states. And it's like the environmentalists say: think globally, act locally.
Exactly. And there's such a record there. There's such a historical record in the illusion of history. I mean, once you start looking into this, and we will get into this probably the second hour, but I will say you've actually tracked so much throughout history. I mean, the historical aspect of it is really fascinating to me, and we will get into that. I did want to ask you a little bit about the contactees. Are some of these reports associated with a contactee or abductions?
In some cases, yes. In some cases, yes. There's two levels of this. One level of it is the contactees and abductees that have reported into the databases, and those are few and far between, but there are some out there. And some of them you have to weigh with a grain of salt. Some of them sound pretty wild. let's just take UFO reports. Since I've been writing the column, I started getting invitations. Can we meet for a cup of coffee up at the truck stop? Can you want to come over to our family reunion? We'd love to meet you. And then they'll get me over there with a burger and a beer, and they'll say, this is our Uncle Ralph, and we want him to tell you our family's UFO story.
Oh, wow.
And I would say, wait a minute, your family's UFO story? And what I started finding out every time this happened is I can count on both hands the number of people who have sat me down on a patio and talked to me, and you can see the look in their eyes. They aren't just telling me a story. They are reliving it. You can see it in their eyes. Mm-hmm. You know it's the truth. It's rattling them.
Right.
And the families are handing down UFO stories like family heirlooms.
Mm.
One of the best ones I had is I had an elder in a family in Steuben County, New York. She's in her 80s. And she sat down and told me the story, and she dug out some, would you believe, tin-type pictures of these ancestors of their family, and showed me tin types of these people from the late 1890s. And it says when these two girls were little girls in the 1880s, they had to walk. There's a proverbial story your grandmother or great-grandmother used to say, I used to have to walk 7 miles to school, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
These kids had to walk 7 miles to school because they were in a place called Cameron, New York, out towards where Bath is. If you look on the map, you'll see Bath, New York. It's kind of to the southwest of that. It's rural now. It's very rural now. It was wilderness then. Mm-hmm. Okay, very hilly area, lots of rattlesnakes. Mm-hmm. And these kids, there were kids from several farms walking to school, to the proverbial one-room schoolhouse. It was in the spring, April of 1880, and they were getting ready to go across a little bridge. And down by the water of the bridge, by the running water of that very heavy stream, were half a dozen little bald men in blue coveralls. Sound like Grays?
Yeah.
Sound like the Guardians,
Interesting.
And these guys waved them on. Oh, yeah, come on, you can cross the bridge. And they were all spooked by these little guys. They were all bald, had big eyes, and all the kids ran home crying and screaming. And this story was handed down through those two little girls from this one family, and those girls grew up to be school teachers. Wow. And that's one of the older, I don't want to call it abduction, but like a close encounter of like the second kind of thing,
Mm-hmm. Very eerie.
There was one guy out in Lake George, out in eastern New York State. Had some friends over, and they were talking on that back porch of his cabin up on Lake George, and they saw something funny like a UFO kind of thing, and left and everything. And later, he heard a humming sound. And that was the last thing he remembered till 3 days later. He woke up in somebody else's clothes about 10 miles from where he lived. And it looked like he had had medical examinations, stuff.
Wow.
And, of course, he told the state police. They picked him up, and they took him to medical people to be checked out. Of course, they wrote him off as a kook, because nobody believed his story. Mm-hmm. They thought he was drugged or something. They didn't know. And the guy left. He moved away from it. He sold the cabin. He sold his property up on Lake George. And he moved to New York City. He wanted to be in the most populated area he could. He did not want to live alone.
Mm-hmm. I guess I don't blame him. He probably had some trauma with that. Now, yeah, it sounds like he needed to be mingling with other people. Now, there is sort of a paranormal flare-up in the Lake George area, isn't there? It's more of a, I don't want to say anomalous, but it seems kind of seems like there's a little bit of an esoteric paranormal kind of energy there too. Would you say or no?
I have heard that from some people, but I personally can't attest to it. Okay. I can talk to the spookiness of the Finger Lakes, and we've had our share of what I'm going to call the USOs, the underwater, undersea UFOs, in the Finger Lakes area. In fact, there's one Native American legend, And the legend talks about some lady did something, and when she fell off the cliff, ever since she fell off that cliff, every now and then, a couple times a year, they will see a brightness come out of the water and hover above the water and shoot off into the sky, and in their legends say it is her soul coming out and being free. But when you hear something rose up out of the lake and hovered and took off in a shining stream, it sounds an awful lot like a UFO,
Right.
So, but there's a lot of stories like that up through the Finger Lakes, a lot of very, very spooky stories. We have a thing, there's a place, there's a number of these things around the country, around the world actually, there's about 80 of them. They're called geomagnetic hills. Mm-hmm. And the one in New York State, it's up in Yates County, sort of out almost near Rochester. We call it Spook Hill in New York State.
Okay. Nice.
It's one of those places where you can drive your car up over the hill and get to the bottom of the hill, put your car in neutral, and it will pull your car slowly back up the hill.
Oh, wow.
Okay, and they're called geomagnetic hills. There's about 80, I think, if you Google geomagnetic hills, I think there's like 80 or 88 of them known ones in the world. Well, I had a lot of people coming up to me last year at the job I had at the time, and they would come up to me in the cafeteria and they'd say, "Oh, Cheryl, you should look up the Spook Hill. I bet there's lots of UFO activity up there." Okay. And so I said one day, well, what the heck? Let me take a look at it. It's got that county has one of the lowest UFO counts in the state. And that may be in itself, the evidence there is maybe very telling in itself. Maybe they don't go there because of this geomagnetic hill,
Right, yeah.
So it's hard to say. But New York State, a lot of people say, when I went to do the talk about New York State, most people want to go to a UFO convention, you're expecting to hear about Roswell, you're expecting to hear about, Rendlesham Forest, and, all this kind of stuff. The last place people were expected to hear about was New York State. Mm-hmm. And then when I started telling them the stories of some of the fantastic stuff that happened before the 20th century, I had a dozen stories that went from 1790 to 1905, And I looked out there and I said, look, for all you skeptics that think UFOs are a modern phenomena since 1947, I'm here to tell you, no, it isn't.
Right. That's huge because, a lot of people will say that too. And even me, I say some of it's probably covert technology, reverse engineered craft. But when you go down, and I love this about you because when we start talking about this, and we can do this in the next hour, when we talk about before there was a big record of a lot of data and before the technological leaps, we're dealing with some kind of an anomalous craft activity traversing the planet. Yes.
I wrote a paper. I was finishing a long overdue bachelor's degree last year, mm-hmm. and I got my degree back in February. Yay!
Sweet. Yay! Congratulations.
Thank you. And my degree is a Bachelor of Arts in Entertainment Writing and Production.
Nice.
The only one like it in New York State was custom tailored to me, and now it's a template for others if they want to do a similar study, interdisciplinary study pattern. Well, the deal was this. I had to write a term paper for a creative writing class. And I had never read, I personally had never read the story of Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving. And I read it as an adult. Now, I remember a nun reading it to us when we were in third grade. But I never, and you see little bits of it, the elements of it in cartoons and things like this. I remembered all of those sorts of things, but I had never actually read it like as an adult. I read the story for myself. And it's a 12, 15-page short story, or, that type of thing. So what happened was I read the story, and of course I'm, almost a year and a half into writing my column, and I read this thing, and I said, gosh, this reads like a modern abduction account. Like, give you an example. He goes into a strange thing with strange little guys, and then comes back and it's 20 years later. What part doesn't sound like an abduction here,
Yeah.
So I went to my professor and I said, hey, would you object to me doing my term paper on Rip Van Winkle on the premise that, maybe it's based in some Hudson Valley or Native American, colonial or Native American story of an abduction. Maybe that's where, Washington Irving got it. Mm-hmm. And she thought that sounded like a fascinating idea. Yes. So I got her blessing to do it. All right, what happens? I come back to her about a month before the paper's due, and I said, Maureen, we got a problem. And she says, what's the problem? I said, well, my paper is looking more like a history paper than a literature paper. And she said, okay, so what's wrong with that? And I said, well, a number of things. First thing, Washington Irving plagiarized the story that is Rip Van Winkle. And she was rolling her. I looked at her and she was rolling her eyes. She says, "Really?" I says, "Yeah." He stole it from a German guy by the name of Johann Nightingale. And his story is only about 3 pages long, and it reads more like a UFO abduction one than Irving's does. And then, so I said, the story actually, what would be what our abduction story didn't happen in the Hudson Valley. And I know a number of UFOologists who have written papers for school, high school or college. They came back and told me later they wrote papers. Oh, yeah, I did one about the Hudson Valley and, UFOs and everything. I said, yeah, but did you find the German connection? And they said, what are you talking about? And the bottom line is, it happened to the Kleppesen Mountains in central Germany and had nothing to do with hunting. The guy was tending his goats. Peter, the goat herd, was tending his goats. One of his goats kept creeping away every day, and one day he goes into what looked like a cave that opened up into a fascinating place, and he found 12 uniformed knights. Okay? And he stayed with them for a time and did some things with them, like set their pins or something, okay? They're like a bowling pins or something like that. Now, whenever you see a cartoon or something that represents Rip Van Winkle, they always show him waking up 20 years later, and he's got a beard down to his ankles, and he's all gray and all this stuff, right?
Right.
All right. Both stories say that the beard only grew a foot. Both stories say it grew a foot. Northern Germanic males grow beard rate at about a half an inch a month. At that rate, a 1 foot beard, assuming he was clean shaven, he would have been gone 24 months. If you crank that back against the 20 years in relativity formulas, which a friend of mine and I did, that would be just about the right period of time. He was gone about physically 24 months, but that turned into 20 years from a relativity standpoint.
Oh, wow.
The old idea that, if you go to Alpha Centauri at the speed of light, many more years pass here on Earth than did for you, that kind of thing.
Right.
And it was that kind of a thing. My English teachers my literature professor came back to me and begged me to get it published. Nobody will publish it.
Did you publish it yourself?
Yeah, sort of. I'm probably going to do something on that order. The UFO columns won't publish it because it's literature. I went to Fate magazine. They wouldn't touch it. Of all people, they would not touch it. I went to literature magazines, and they wouldn't touch it because it was UFO related. So there's this whole stovepipe thing in our culture that if it's not their flavor, they're not going to take a pass on it and try something different.
Right.
So I've got to find just the right people to publish this thing. I did a reduced version, like a little summary of my paper in my column. I caught a lot of criticism from a lot of people who didn't read the whole paper. But there was a lot of fascination by people who did, or who read my summary and liked it a lot. So,
well, great. Well, listen, we're going to take a break, everybody. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back with Cheryl Costa on Hyperspace. Welcome back, everybody, to the Dark Matter Radio Network. I'm your host, Solaris BlueRaven, and this is Hyperspace, and I'm here with my very special guest, Cheryl Costa. And Cheryl, you with me?
Yep.
All right. And, I think you should self-publish that article. I just think that, when all else fails, do it yourself.
If I self-publish, I don't know where to self-publish it. Is the problem?
Right.
I'm open to ideas.
Okay.
I thought about possibly putting it up, making it a Kindle article, but I'm not sure what to do with it.
Well, I'm sure something will come along. I always say CreateSpace. I hear a lot of good things about it. I haven't used it, but I've heard that's pretty decent. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The trick is like I said, I've gone to half a dozen UFO. In fact, I even reached out to Giorgio at Ancient Aliens.
Oh, okay.
Because part of the article, I quite literally talk about the fact that in approximately in a similar period of time in Germany, you had these huge UFO sightings over Hamburg and Nuremberg, Germany. 5 years apart. It looked like Star Wars kind of battles going on, right? And there's like wood block paintings and that type of thing of these artwork out there. If your listeners Google Nuremberg or Google Hamburg, Germany, and UFOs, you'll get artwork like that to show you stuff like that. It's pretty classic stuff. I think if you'd like, we can talk a little bit about some of the pre-1947 sightings. If
you're so psychic, you read me very well. But before that, my producer said Kindle Shorts published through, I guess. If you heard of Kindle Shorts?
Kindle Shorts.
Kindle Shorts. Yeah, I believe that's what Keith is saying. If it's something that...
Kindle Shorts. Yes,
right.
yes. I have heard of that. That might be a good place for it.
Yeah, that's what Keith said. Thank you, Keith. All right, and also, so yes, you are reading my mind, and let's go there, and also let's go way back too. I'd like to go back to like the real early sightings. Whatever you have, let's start.
The earliest one I have is from 1790 up in Scolari County, New York. This at that time, this is colonial America. It is about 15 years after the Revolution. Okay. Up in Scolari County, which is southwest of the Albany area, there was a Deutsch settler. Now, people tell me, oh, he was a German settler. No, he was probably Dutch. And I kind of confirmed that with some of my one of my history professors at the college. All right, well, this guy was one night during the growing season, summertime. He was on his front porch around twilight, fiddling with his fiddler, with his violin, and he heard this huge roaring sound. And coming from the north, he saw a brightness, and the brightness kept getting closer and closer and closer, and it came down about 300 yards in a field, about 300 yards from his cabin. He said the brightness was so bright that if he had wanted to get down on his front porch and pick up pins, it was bright enough to do it. Remember, this is sunset, okay? This thing sort of landed. It didn't really land in the dirt. It hovered above the ground. He said it was about 100 yards long. On one end, which was the big end, it sort of, in fact, I tell your readers or your listeners, kind of hold your arm out and hold your fingers out like a claw. Okay? He said it looked like a tree uprooted. So if you look at your arm, that's kind of what the look was. If you got your hand out like a claw, it was a tree uprooted, and then he said it tapered back to a long taper, he said, reminiscent of a serpentine or a snake. Okay. For a time after it came and hovered above the ground, it sparked, and the sparks he said it looked like a hot welding iron. Well, welding in those days was done with a very hot iron done in like a forge, and then you brought it out and you used it to melt lead or silver solder into a seam, okay, and you used this hot point that you had in the fire until it got good red and hot, and then you kind of flowed the solder into the joint, lead or silver solder, and so it sparked like hot metal. Okay, he said then it began moving. He says it was as big around as a prize hog. And if you've ever seen a large pig, it's as big around as a cow. Mm-hmm. Okay? And it started moving, and he said it was moving at the speed of a galloping horse. And then it got to a certain hill, and as it approached the hill, it simply rose to meet the hill. It rose up over the hill, glided up over the hill, and down over the other side, and that was the last he saw of it. Mm. He referred to it as a meteor. Mm-hmm. He didn't know what else to call it. And a couple of years later, when he was at the county seat in Carlisle, he swore out an affidavit for the town clerk. And the story comes to us through the Historical Society up there.
Wow. That's pretty amazing. So do you think it was a meteor?
No.
I mean, that's what I was going to say. I mean...
Well, they didn't have the vocabulary for this stuff then,
right.
But just the description, meteors come and go whiz, bang, boom, and then, blow a crater or something like that. They don't hover above the ground and then go under what I'm going to say intelligent control. I personally think it was probably a probe, but that's me, okay? Let's see.
Fascinating.
The next good one we've got is, let's see, how about 1860 and 1861?
Okay.
1860. In 1860, this is July of 1860, Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, John Breckinridge, and John Bell were all campaigning for president at the time. This is the historical things that were in the headlines at that time. They were having a war in Syria at the time, between the Drusus and the Christian sect there. They always seem to have a war going on in Syria, don't they?
Truly.
Okay. All right. Well, what happened was it was initially first seen up around Albany, coming from the north. Two great balls of fire. Okay. My title for this was the 1860 UFO Chariots of Fire over New York. Okay. It was first reported up around Albany, New York. It flew sort of down away from the Hudson Valley, but down parallel to the Hudson Valley. In New York City, they saw it. And even the reporters that wrote for the newspapers said this wasn't like a meteor that goes, whiz by. Oh, did you see that? That kind of thing. That's what most people see when there's a shooting star or a meteor go by. It's like that. Oh my God, you missed it if you blinked. This, they said, it traveled across the dark horizon. This is about 9:25 at night. They said it took over a minute for it to cross the horizon. Okay, these two balls of fire. The next report was down around Philadelphia, and then we have a newspaper report from Washington, D.C., the old Washington Star newspaper, and there's another report from the last report down the eastern seaboard was in Norfolk, Virginia. And they report those two balls of fire going into a cloud bank, and that was the last anybody had seen them. And the time they reported was about 9:35. So they traveled over this distance of about 470 miles over a period of about 10 to 15 minutes. We did a calculation, me and a pilot friend of mine did a calculation that the speed that it took to go across the horizon, a window of the horizon, if you look out at the horizon at night, would be about 60 to 70 miles to cross that, and to do it in a minute they estimate the speed somewhere to be 1,700 to 3,200 miles per hour. That's well within the speed of some of our supersonic aircraft now, some of our high-end military craft. The 3,200 miles per hour is well within the range of a space shuttle in the lower atmosphere after they've kind of gone through their burn phase, okay? It's a re-entry speed, okay, after in the lower atmosphere. But there was nothing flying in those days. And so people say, wow, what could it have been? And it certainly wasn't a meteor, because a meteor, we know from the Russian meteor back in 2012, the thing came in at 50,000 miles an hour. People barely saw it, and it went boom. Mm-hmm. And these were seen in the sky over a distance of almost 500 miles by a lot of people for a period of about 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. That in my book is a controlled reentry.
Sounds like it. Yeah. So it's not a shooting star, I don't think.
No. So that was the Chariots of Fire.
Nice.
Civil War era. About a year later, New York City. To your listeners, I give them the physical reference to New York City at that era. If you ever saw the TV series that was on BBC, New Amsterdam, or the movie that was out there, The Gangs of New York. Mm-hmm. New York City in those days was never more than about 4 to 5 story high buildings. They were usually wood. Very few of them were brick. There was just limits to what they could do with building until such time as they started developing structural steel. Okay? So remember, the buildings in New York City and Manhattan in those days in 1860 were 2 to 3 or 4, maybe tops 5-story buildings, and that was it. Mm-hmm. All right. There was a notorious place called 5 Points, and then Gangs of New York is kind of like set there. 5 Points was a very, very, very bad part of town. Very poor immigrants got pushed there. Every sort of ethnic gang you can think of thrived there. Okay. Well, one night in March, it was a very warm evening in March. President Lincoln had been president about a month, and about midnight, this lady looked out her attic apartment window and saw what appeared to be a shiny, flaming cross in the sky. Okay. Now, her account comes to us. Remember, paper in those days was considered a very valuable commodity. Okay, it isn't as common as we have now. It was a very valuable commodity. So she confessed it to a priest in a church a short time later, and it was scribbled into the margins of a baptismal record. Okay. In fact, my editor wanted proof of it, and someone had given me a copy of the PDF shot of it, and I gave it to my editor, and he was fascinated. Well, the bottom line was a modern researcher went back and looked at old newspapers from that week to see if anything else had been reported. Interestingly enough, on the same vector where she said she saw this thing out by the Church of the Transfiguration, about a block beyond that, there was a huge block-size fire. The entire block was an inferno. So there was a couple of warehouses, a laboratory, and a few of other, what I'm going to call warehouse district kind of businesses. Mm-hmm. Okay, livery stable, that kind of thing. And the whole block got on fire, and the whole block went up. Okay, mm-hmm. The cross is estimated to have been above it. So could it have been a craft hovering above the city, studying our culture of that era, and the flames of that block-sized fire, which lit things up for miles, was reflecting off the shiny hull of the craft, like it would off the bottom of an airplane or something like that.
Right.
Okay, and that's what the modern researcher speculates.
That's fascinating. Wow, I love these stories. I really do. I mean, I think it's so interesting to go back because nowadays, mainstream media is just like, they don't tell the truth and it's all just an obfuscation. But at least back then, there was a little bit of truth in there. People were innocent and they were reporting information. Don't you kind of get that vibe?
Yeah. In fact, I go 9 rounds with some of my journalistic friends. Why do you report such baloney? They say to me, and they usually use a more colorful word. And I tell them, I says, look, I'm simply reporting what people say they saw. And I looked at a bunch of my reporter friends, and I said, hey guys, you guys are missing out on the greatest story not told.
Yep, I agree.
Okay, because somebody pushed it down, and my flavor is, look, all the major newspapers and press and television outlets and all that kind of stuff, all of them are controlled by maybe half a dozen companies now.
Yep.
Okay, so it's very easy to control them. So to speak.
Yeah, and what I don't understand is why they have to try to discredit it. What's the big deal? I mean, I know we're star beings in general. I mean, we're all connected to the universe. So what's the big deal? Even if we just decide to go ahead and just release everything and just open it all up, I mean, what's the problem? What do you think is the real problem behind people just trying to cover this stuff up?
I talked to a guy, what I'm going to call a real man in black. And not one of the alien ones. I'm talking a guy who's like in the intelligence circles. We had a long chat about this, and at one of the conventions. And this guy's a retired colonel. And he said, look, he said, it's probably not the government sitting on it, because the government's got better things to do. Okay? But all the information that got, with Roswell and things like that, the government didn't know what to do with those crashes. And there was another one they had another one back during World War II out in, I think it was Illinois or Iowa. They had the town minister come over to do last rites for the occupant of the vehicle, for God's sakes.
I want to hear more of that.
And they had, the Germans supposedly captured one back in the 30s in the Harz Mountains or something like that. That's where Werner von Braun got some of his ideas. So the deal is, they didn't know what to do with the technology and the stuff. This was the government, and it was the Army. Not that they know about this stuff. They weren't engineers. They were soldiers. So they went to places like Dartmouth and Duke and Princeton and places and MIT. They went to these people with these things, grant money, and swore secrecy in these places. So it got into what I'm going to call the early version of the military-industrial complex. Colleges and industry and all of that sort of thing. And if you have the knowledge of something, you have control over something. And you have, that's what that's what all this is about. I went to the editor of a major paper here in New York State with my preliminary slides of this New York State study. Okay, my editor told me go ahead and try it, see if somebody else would even take an interest. Couldn't even get on his calendar.
Wow.
He entertained. I traded 2 emails with him and asked him if I could get 10 minutes on his calendar to give him a pitch. He said, perhaps. He says, can you give me a hint what the pitch is about? And I said, I have data from recent research regarding unidentified flying objects in New York State, and it might make for a really good feature story, provided you find the material intriguing and motivating. And if you don't, I'm happy. Thank you for your time, and that's my feeling on it. And if you want to do it, put me in touch with the right guys in your business, and we'll do this. He wouldn't even take the appointment.
Oh, gee! Wow.
This is the president of a particular major newspaper in New York State.
That's a shame. That really is.
I went to 3 news directors for 3 different television stations. They wouldn't take my meeting. I went to 3 news directors at 3 radio stations, including a public radio, who you would think would be a little bit more liberal. They wouldn't return my phone calls.
Wow. What a bunch of squirrels. Good grief.
So I went back to my editor. I went back to my editor and he said, nobody's interested. He said, so fine. He says, we'll just publish a feature story ourselves. I already have worldwide readership in my column already. The beauty of the internet, if you know what I'm saying. Who would have thought a little dinky paper in upstate New York would have worldwide readership? But I do, so it works out nicely that way.
That's awesome.
Let's talk about another sighting.
Yeah.
This is a really cool one. And again, this prejudice with the newspapers is very evident in this particular story. 1879, UFO mothership over New York City. Okay? All right. Almost didn't do this story because the astronomer who watched the thing was in New Jersey. And that's not my beat. I don't do Jersey. So I read through the initial report of this guy, and I said, wait a minute, this is interesting, because he calls out, like an article published about his reciting in Scientific American and also in a particular New York paper that was not the New York Times. New York Times has a history of ignoring these things. So, again, I have a wife who's a librarian. So I contacted her, and she put her little minions at the college library to work, and they found me a copy of that 1879 Scientific American article.
Nice.
And it's very small, but like a letter to editor kind of thing. They also got me a copy of the New York City article. So I saw exactly what the guy was talking about. Well, basically, the paper printed his letter to the editor, but they wouldn't report the story per se. Well, what happened was a number of other people, a lot of people are calling it hogwash, he's full of baloney and all this other stuff, but a number of other astronomers in the Connecticut and upstate New York area saw the same thing, and they all started putting the data together. Okay? And they had better numbers than he did. And they didn't, and some of his skeptics didn't like his numbers. Astronomers are big on numbers and angles and all that kind of thing, okay? Well, ultimately, what they came up with was this thing had to be moving at a tremendous speed in order to hover over New York City, because the Earth turns very quickly. First thing, they estimate the thing was at about 102 miles above New York Harbor.
Wow.
Okay, which meant it had to be moving, very, very fast. I mean, thousands of miles an hour to stay synchronous with New York City and where it was as the Earth turned. Unlike like a geosynchronous satellite, from like your TV stuff, sits out there 24,000 miles, and it basically rotates. It rotates with the Earth, but it's moving at a tremendous speed because it's turning in a ratio to stay matched up with the Earth. Well, this thing was at 102 miles, which was nowhere near as far as a geosynchronous satellite. The other thing, on the size of the thing, they estimate it to be a circular to oval shape and a half a mile in diameter.
Wow.
Now, that's a mothership.
Yeah, no kidding. Wow.
That is like the great palaces in the sky that they describe in the Mahabharata in India in ancient times.
It's fascinating.
So that's the 1879 mothership over New York City.
Wow. That's pretty cool.
Now, let's see. I told you about let's see. I told you about the 1880 kids, with the little guys in the jumpsuits and things like that. Let's move into the 20th century. Okay. All right. 1939 UFO New York World's Fair event. The report was in the National UFO Reporting Database. And I read the thing, and it said, 1933 New York World's Fair. Okay. And she described, there was a little description of what she saw during a concert and what they call a water, these big shows people do with like steerable water jets and big fountains and that kind of thing. It was a show, something like that. And I read this account, and I said, all right, fine, great, and dandy. Now, see, I'm a bit of a reenactor. I do reenactment stuff with people. and some of the stuff we do is set like in the 20s, 30s, 40s, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And think of it like we do what they call live action role play.
Right.
Okay, so we'll take a weekend, and from the time we come in on Friday night to the time we leave on Sunday night, we are that 1935 personality or that 1925 personality.
Oh, fun!
We are that person. Okay, and we'll take over some ski resort or something like that, and for that weekend we'll be up there, kind of in a combination Indiana Jones, Mrs. Marple's Mysteries, and God knows what else, G-Men, adventure or some sort, right? Okay, that's the nature of it. And we all dress period and all this kind of stuff. It's kind of fun. All right, well, I'm kind of read up on those eras. So one night I must have rolled over around 4 o'clock in the morning, and I whispered to myself, New York City didn't have a World's Fair in 1933. Because that's what was in the database. And I've heard other people quote this report in books. I've seen it in books. Other people have quoted it right out of the database. Didn't do their homework. Okay? Well, here's the homework.
Okay.
The homework was this. New York City didn't have a World's Fair in 33. Chicago did. It's the Century of Progress. So I thought, well, maybe she's mistaken. Maybe she went to Chicago. Okay, the lady reported it. So I did a little bit of research on the Century of Progress, and yes, indeed, the Graf Zeppelin visited the convention, visited the fair there. But this lady insists that it was the opening day of the event, and it was like in April, May timeframe when they opened it. The Graf Zeppelin didn't visit the Chicago thing until October, and only for one day. I said, that doesn't work. So the Internet is a wonderful thing. I managed to get brochures, PDF brochures of both conventions, or both World Fairs, downloaded, and I printed them. And I looked through the features of what was going on at both World's Fairs. And the 1939 one had a nightly gas jet and water jet show with live music being broadcast through the entire fairgrounds through a new thing called stereo. Okay? And from a live orchestra, it was an original piece of music that was written, conducted by a very famous conductor of that era, and that's what it was described as. And I said, this has got to be the event. She just got the date wrong. It was 1939. It was in the spring. So since I had scant information for my article, what I did was my editor got pictures from the National Archives and from Library of Congress of the 1939 World Fair. And I took, using her brochure, I gave my readers kind of a tour of what the first couple of days of the fair, or what a family would have seen those first days at the World's Fair. And what this lady saw that night when they had the concert with tons and tons of water being shot up in the air with these colorful gas jets and all of this stuff, and this beautiful music playing, and this water and guns and water jets and gas jets were being orchestrated by 4 people to orchestrate it with the music. I described all of that in my article, and then I worked her citing into it, that this thing, while they were watching this concert and this jet show, this thing came down in the clouds above them. There was this glowing mass hovering in the clouds above them for like 20 minutes. Half the audience saw it, and then it just kind of drifted away and drifted out of sight.
That's interesting. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Let's see. Let's take one on 1934. Again, I'm trying to, for the most part, I'm just trying to stay pre-47 for a minute.
Okay.
Tioga County, New York, on New York's southern tier. If you were to look at a New York State map and you see Binghamton, and to the west of it you would see Owego. Owego is in Tioga County. Tioga County in 1934 was, again, very, very rural. It was a 2-lane asphalt road. What's there now and that wound up and down through the hills and valleys in that area. What's down there through now is I-86, and that runs along the river, okay? But in those days, it was an over-hill, over-dale kind of asphalt road. Okay, this little girl, and I had this on first account from the lady. She was like 89 years old. She contacted me through the newspaper and wanted to tell me about this 1934 sighting when she was 8 years old. Thanksgiving Day, they were coming back from her grandparents' house in Binghamton, New York, and to go back to their house in Waverly, which is in Cuyahoga County. Nowadays, it would be about 45-minute to an hour drive. Then it was about an hour and a half, 2-hour drive. Okay? They're driving up over past this cow pasture, and they come up over a rise, and she yelled at her father, "Please, stop the car, there's something down there in the field." Father slammed on his brakes. He said, "What?" He says, "There's a Greyhound bus down there in the field." He said, "What?" So he gets out. She gets out of the car in her Sunday best, much to her mother's chagrin. They both climb, her father and her climb over the fence, and down there in this field is this circular thing. From the side, it looked like a Greyhound bus with big windows, and you could see the form of like people behind it. And it was sitting in the middle of this cow pasture. And the two of them trudged out into the cow pasture, and remember, she's in her Sunday best, so she's stepping into cow pies and all this stuff. And they stood there and watched it for a couple of minutes, and then after a couple of minutes, they saw it lift up off the ground, hover there about 6-7 feet off the ground, and then it shot off into the sky. They got back into the car, and the husband was telling the wife, "Did you see that?" And the mother saw it, and she was hysterical. Screaming at the top of her lungs, she was hysterical. Got the kid back in the car, and they drove home. This lady, Violet, told me that her parents would never, ever talk about it ever again. It terrified them so much.
Wow. That's interesting.
Go ahead. Nothing they'd ever seen before. And when she'd never told anybody except a couple close relatives until she read my articles. And she contacted me through the newspaper and said, "Thank God somebody's telling the truth about this stuff. I want to tell you my story."
Wow.
So we talked about it. I talked to her like 2 different evenings. We talked about it at length, and it was a fascinating story.
Yeah. What a historian you are. My goodness.
Well, yeah, it's getting. I didn't expect to be doing this, but like I said, like my old playwright teacher used to say, playwrights are the historian of their age. So, okay, let's take one in 1947. Okay. All right, 1947. Now, Roswell was reported in the New York Times, or actually it was reported in the Roswell paper on July 8th, 1947. Okay? When did we drop the atom bomb? July 1945, and then August in Japan, 2 bombs in August 1945. Okay? All right. February 1947, 2 Syracuse University students are walking across the campus. It's cold. If you've never been to Syracuse in February, know that it's one of those places where you can comb your hair with an ice cube or an icicle, because it is colder than blazes here. All right, they were going across campus, and they were going past the Holden Observatory. Now, the Holden Observatory is one of your classic little buildings, 1890s kind of buildings. It was built with big stones and everything like this. It kind of looks like a castle. Has a big dome on top of it for the observatory aspects of it. And they saw that the dome was open, and they saw it looked like the telescope was panning the sky, left to right kind of thing. And they saw the door was open, so they went in. Now, observatories typically aren't heated because heating affects the optics and things. So the astronomers are in there in a winter coat. Okay, this guy's in there, and he's walking back and forth, and he's looking through the telescope. And he hears these two kids behind him. He turns around and says, "Oh my God, thank God you're here." And he says, what do you mean? And this guy says, "You've got to look at this." He doesn't tell him what it is that he's looking at. And he kind of positions the scope, and he lets one guy look through it. And he puts a finger to his mouth and says, like a whisper, don't say anything. The second guy looks through it. He sees what's in it. And then he says, "Okay, what'd you see?" And both of these guys saw many, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 of these dish-shaped craft flying in formation at this very high altitude. Okay, in lines, like 3, 4, 5 across, and just lines of them. Okay? Mm-hmm. And the shape of the craft, imagine if you have like a quarter and you were to clip off a little clip of on one side of it, so it wasn't perfectly round. It was some kind of little indentation. It was kind of almost what I'm going to call, I don't want to call it arc-shaped, but it was disc-shaped with a little bit of a dip in the back of it, okay? And that's what they both described. They both sketched it out for the guy, and that's what he found. He said, "Thank God, somebody else besides me seeing this." Okay? And that's the last they ever heard of the professor. Oh. And yeah. And both these guys are retiring now, and they came forward to tell the story. And that was, let's see, February. So March, April, May, June. That was 5 months before Roswell.
Oh my goodness!
That this professor and these guys saw tons of these craft at a extremely high altitude flying in formation.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating.
And now let's talk a little bit about Roswell for a minute. What's interesting about Roswell, most people don't know, is there was a paper done in 1968 by, I don't remember the guy's name off the top of my head, and my computer shut off so I can't look it up. This guy was a member of NICAP, the old National Investigative Group. It was like a predecessor to MUFON. Mm-hmm. And NICAP was investigating UFOs in those days. And this guy was a professional actor. He was in tour shows, that type of thing. And he was a UFO enthusiast and a member of NICAP. And what he did was he was on tour, different towns, various cities. They were on tour. They'd do their show in the evening, and he had the afternoon pretty much to kill. So he would go to the town library and look up any kind of accounts. He'd ask the libraries, were there any accounts of flying saucers or UFOs or anything like this? And he looked this stuff up. This is in the late 40s. He did, not 40s, but he did this in the late 50s, early 60s. Okay? Mm-hmm. Every place he went, he looked up this stuff in the town libraries, and he amassed this huge, and what he studied was around the time of Roswell. The New York Times reported in the week that Roswell was reported, before Roswell broke in the paper in Roswell, before Roswell was ever talked about, they had massive UFO sightings being reported by the Associated Press by people in 38 states. Mm. Wow. Hundreds of sightings of UFOs all over the country. Of course, the New York Times is making fun of them because as people started saying, "Hey, some of them look like saucers, some of them look like inverted watch tubs, some of them said they were purple, some of them said they were orange balls," and the New York Times made fun of them and said, "Hey, now they're coming in colors and different shapes." The thing is, we know 65 years later, as we know now, there's about 80 different configurations, and they do come in different colors. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was all going on. In fact, when I was writing my paper for the convention, I did a small study about what articles were reported in the New York Times at that era, because there was a lot of stuff going on. In June leading up to it. Now, some of that had to do with the fact that that guy Ken Arnold was a well-off businessman. He was a pilot and everything. Was flying through the Cascade Mountains out there in Washington, and he saw a small squadron of UFOs. And oh, by the way, the sketches of what they show us in magazines match what these guys saw in Syracuse.
Mm.
Same shape, same profile.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you look at this guy's report from 1968 is when he wrote his report, the incident of sightings in late June to early July in the United States shot up from nothing to this very high peak of several hundred, like almost 700.
Wow. That's amazing.
And the curve was almost straight up and straight down. And it was over what the term I used, I had a slide in my report, in my presentation, 23 days in 1947. It was in that 23-day window there was this massive amount of UFOs showing up, okay, all over the country. Now, were they all over the country? According to this gentleman's report, they were in very specific areas. They were in the Southwest. They were up in the Washington Mountains. There was a particular general who was quoted in the New York Times. They asked him, "Hey, General, where have you been?" He was like head of the Army Air Corps at that time. They hadn't split the Army Air Corps off to be the Air Force yet, and as a separate service. And they asked him where he was. He said, "Oh, I was on a fishing trip up in Washington." Well, I call him a liar, because where he went for fishing was about 60 miles south of where all the action was going on up in Washington State. 35, 40, 50 sightings up in that area over a period of about 2, 3, 4 days. Okay? So the bottom line in this thing, I had showed this to some people, and I showed his report out to some people. And I said, "What does this look like to you?" And this one guy looked at me and he said, "Hey, I'm in the Civil Air Patrol, and whenever a plane goes down, there's this whole flurry of activity. And this looks like the kind of activity we have when we go out looking for some crashed plane." I said, "Yeah, I know. I came to the same conclusion. Maybe this is Starship Down, and everybody, the Roswell crash was real, and all of this other UFO sighting stuff that was going on, because let me stop a second. They suggest that the Roswell crash actually may have happened in mid-June sometime, because it might have been weeks before Mr. Brazel ever found it."
Oh, that's interesting.
Most people these days will say, "Oh, the next day Brazel reported it." No. Brazel didn't find it. He had a very big ranch, and he didn't find this thing. And he said even the animals had been trying to eat at some of the remains. It may have happened several weeks before. Okay? Well, if you look at the wave of these sightings, the way these sightings curve up, it kind of coincides with when that crash may have happened. Did a distress call go out when these two craft crashed? Remember, there was the crash in Roswell, and there was the other one at Aurora,
right?
50, 60 miles to the west. Okay, was this a Starship Down, and the Galactic Federation put out a rescue call, and everybody was beating the bushes looking for these guys?
Oh wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, it's highly possible.
Yeah, and I had a long talk with Stanton Friedman over a lunch mention, and it was amazing. You know, he put me onto this report by the NICAP. So I had completely separate information. I did not know about the NICAP report, and I accumulated essentially the same material, a similar material, but similar data. And he told me, "You've got to read this report." So we found a PDF of it on the internet, and I printed it out, and I had it tacked up all over the wall. My poor spot, I got one wall here. It's got more pinholes in it than you can shake a stick at. But
you remind me of the UFO Carl Kolchak. You know, remember?
Yeah. I've had a few people call me something like that. You know, somebody referred to me as Carl Mulder at one point.
Oh, that's great. Well, you know what's fascinating? What you just touched on is, like, I don't hear people talking about that at all, and I find it fascinating.
Well, that's the funny thing about it, because the way that some of these TV programs you see up on, Unexplained Files and H2 and all this other stuff that do, I'm not talking Ancient Aliens, but I'm talking some of these other programs that do it, they always go for Roswell as like the start of this thing, and it wasn't the start of this thing.
Right.
There was much more other stuff going on. And Roswell just happened to be, in fact, it was on the newspaper. It didn't even make the front page of the newspaper here in New York. It did. There was a sidebar story on the front page of the New York Times, because remember, we don't have instant press then like we do now with CNN and things like this, right? So it was on the headlines on the paper yesterday. It didn't make press time until the next day in New York, but by that time the Army had blown it off and said, oh, it was just a weather balloon. And in those days, people believed generals.
Right, yeah, exactly. Well, do you think it was a distraction? It seemed like it was a distraction. Yeah,
I think because they did come out with a report initially saying, hey, we captured one, and then suddenly, oh, nope, we made a mistake, because somebody higher up realized, hey, there's some national security implications here. And it was later that same year that Truman signed the National Security Act, which puts a lid on just about anything they want to put a lid on.
Right, yeah.
So, I think this is where a lot of that came from. Well, the bottom line on it is that whether you believe in, I'll give you an example. I was always a little bit skeptical about Roswell. I wasn't about Aurora, but I was a little skeptical about Roswell. And I had heard of it. And then in, 1979-ish, Stanton Friedman interviewed, and nobody ever heard about it after everybody said, oh, the weather balloon, that was it. Everybody forgot about it. And then in 79 or so, Stanton Friedman interviewed Jesse Marcel, who used to be the intelligence officer there. And Jesse was dying of cancer. He said, they can't hurt me now. So he told Stanton the truth. And that's what brought the story back to light, so to speak, that it was this big cover-up. And I think the thing had, again, until I saw that come out with Stanton Friedman's book, I always kind of thought Roswell was maybe it happened, maybe it didn't, whatever. And then I even reserved that right up until about 2 years ago, when I did my own little study of newspaper articles and put my stuff together, and then Stanton put me onto that NICAP article that was a paper, and I put the paper together, and I put all this stuff on the wall, and like I said, it looked like, I don't know if you ever watched that program, Homeland, I had my papers all over the wall. I had yarn running out pin to pin, it looked like a police investigation. And the only conclusion I could come to, and I had several people come in and look at it, and they all came to the same. Some of these people were very disinterested skeptics, and they sat there and they looked at it, and I would give a presentation about what these different elements were and everything, and they came to the same conclusion. The smoking gun was not so much that did Roswell happen, did we find a craft or something like that. Here's all the side information that suggests that maybe all the sightings that happened because Roswell and Aurora happened, 2 starships down. That's the smoking gun.
I agree.
Not the craft itself, but the emergency response that went on around it.
Well, let me ask you something real quick. So do you think that was a real off-world species, that whole, all of those UFOs that were sighted, do you think those are off-world, or do you think they were engineered by perhaps the Germans? Is that a possibility?
That's a tough call.
Okay.
That is a tough call. Maybe.
I'm curious.
There's been stories different ways to say that, maybe they were, maybe they weren't, maybe the Russians, using children to fly the things. I've heard all kinds of stories. And maybe just the fact that there were aliens in it maybe that was the distraction. I don't know. Maybe that's the misinformation. Who knows? I don't know what to make of it. Again, and then there was this whole thing here, the last couple of months here was this whole thing that there might be new Roswell slides out there and all this kind of stuff.
But I heard that was all BS, hoaxed stuff. I understand.
Yeah, especially the amount of the guys were trying to make too much money off of it. In my book, I'm sorry. Yeah, I know I'd like to make more money at this myself, but bottom line, if I had some kind of smoking gun evidence like that, I would want really serious people to look at it,
right,
and not try to cash in for every bloody cent I could get out of it. And I was a little critical about that. But I heard. No, that's just me. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I felt the same way. No, I'm not very critical too. I have to tell you, even when it comes to all this whole area. But I do know there's an off-world intelligence. I don't discount that. I also know that there was reverse engineering being done by the Germans. We have a black technology society that kind of lives in an alternate universe.
Well, there was the old joke back in the late '60s that our rocket program was competing with the Russians' rocket program using both of us using our German scientists.
Right? Yeah.
And maybe it was reverse engineered. The stories you hear about that operation down in Antarctica,
right. That was interesting.
It lends some credence to it. Maybe. Will it all come out? I don't know. As they say, sometimes this black stuff stays black for too long, and a secret long held is hard for anybody to come out. I mean, it took them 50 years to own up to some of the stuff we did in World War II. That was probably not stuff you'd like to be very proud of, but helped win the war,
Right.
So, maybe it will come out, maybe it won't. There's a lot of people who want to... Information is power, and if you sit on information, it's powerful.
Right, and of course people transfer out over the years. They get older and they forget, and unless it's documented, and this is why it's huge that what you're doing is so incredibly important, because you're documenting you're creating a historical benchmark, first of all, by old anomalous sightings that people have forgotten about, and I think that's huge. So I applaud you for doing that. But I mean, not many people are really up to speed on that level. I mean, it's all about the woo-woo and the lights, but let's look at the history and the blueprint behind it,
Well, it's like Stephen Bassett from Paradigm Research. He's the lobby group in D.C. that are trying to get disclosure. They held the citizen hearing on disclosures.
Right.
And he has a good saying, and I like it. I've quoted it a couple of times. It's no longer about lights in the sky. It's about lies on the ground.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's good.
Okay, and it is true. Now, I made a point at the convention. I had a couple of slides in there. A couple of people said, where's your proof? And I said, okay, look, proof is done, and this is important. And I tell you, listeners, listen to this very carefully. Proof is done this way. Proof. And this is my wife, the librarian, talking. Okay, 1. It is done by scholared papers. Anybody out there listening with a master's degree, you know what I'm talking about with the idea of the academic conversation. Scholared papers and peer-reviewed papers published in peer-reviewed type of literature. That's one way of validation where people are doing research. You have to have funding to do that. If there's no funding for it, most people don't do that kind of research. Okay? He who has the money controls the research. Or this can be done by a government agency out there doing publications in government journals and that sort of thing. Again, if you don't have funding, why are you going to do the research on it? Or it's done, validation is generally done by a National Academy of Science type organization. Again, if you don't have funding, there's no priority to do it. Why are you going to do it? So he who owns the money shuts off all the research. Okay?
Very true.
There are a couple of Academy of Sciences in a couple of other countries like Chile and like that who have started to come out with information. But the United States and major Western powers have not done this in their Academy of Sciences. Now, the last source of validation, back before the Internet, major newspapers were considered to be validation sources because, and what they called the newspaper of record, like the New York Times is a newspaper of record. The Washington Post is a newspaper of record. The LA Times is a newspaper of record. So these were ways you would get validation. So what do we have? We have Dr. Condon back in 1968 with the Condon report saying, oh, this is all a bunch of baloney and there's no reason to put any government money into it. Now, he was a very smart man on contract to the Air Force, and being an intellectual college professor, he knew that if you shut off the money, nobody's going to write papers about it.
Very true.
So he thought. Now, he also, in his report, I know we're running out of time, in his report, they blew off all but about 30% of things, and he kind of blew off that 30% of reports of UFOs. Since that time, anybody who has to write a paper always has to cite that paper, that academic paper. I thought about doing a master's paper thesis on this topic matter, and one of my professors said, oh, God, you're going to have problems. When I was at the convention, Stanton Friedman and 2 or 3 other PhD-level professors that we were having supper with Stanton said, no, 13 other PhD papers have been done on this topic that have blown Dr. Condon's paper out of the water.
And Cheryl, we're just
ahead.
about out of time here. We've got 30 seconds. I have to tell you, thank you so much. You've been incredible to have as a guest on the show tonight, and I do want to have you back, and I want to thank you very much. I also want to thank everybody. I want to thank everybody for tuning in this evening as well, and please stay tuned for Dr. J Live coming up next on the Dark Matter Radio Network, of course. And I think we're just about out of here, if I'm not mistaken. We were right down to the wire. How are we doing here, Keith? Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Cheryl. Have a great week, everybody. Thank you, Keith.
Bye-bye.
Bye.